The boy on the beach on the boardwalk just got back from the war. He watches the waves washing the shore birds pecking at tiny crabs in the sand or diving for fish in the shallow surf. There was sand where he'd been, but a long walk to the beach. And the pecking birds were snipers, and the diving birds IEDs. Now that he's home, and home isn't home, what will he do with himself? Maybe he'll go to college or trade school. Maybe he'll re-enlist. He lifts his gaze to the distant horizon where sea meets sky at the edge of the world. He wonders how far he could swim. I think the biggest problem with why there's no anti-war movement was only mentioned in one single sentence today so far. I think the most disastrous consequence of the Vietnam War is the creation of a professional army. Now you have people who are trained and indoctrinated in a brotherhood, who think of themselves as warriors, who don't ask questions, who are there because they chose to be there. Some of them end up wishing they hadn't been, but most of them never question what they're doing or why. And meanwhile, I teach at a school that costs $37,000 a year for 1 year of high school. I've been there for 17 years. I've watched about 1,700 kids graduate. Not a single one of them has chosen to do what I did, get out of high school and join the Marines. Not one. They have options. The kids who are joining the Army and the Navy don't. That's who's fighting our wars for us. The rest of us don't give a flying fuck. The parents of the kids I teach don't care because they're not paying the price. It drives me crazy. Sorry. That wasn't even a poem. Let's see here. Here's this is about the kids that I wrote it for the kids I teach. I'm not qualified, by the way, to teach in the public schools. I have a PhD, I've written 18 books, I've been teaching for 30 years, but public schools say I'm not qualified, which may be part of the problem with public schools. Where is this? Coaching winter track. I'm a track coach. Coaching winter track in time of war. The boys are running suicides on the football field today. 10-yard increments out to the 50 and back again, push-ups in between. It's 30 degrees, but they sweat like it's summer in Baghdad. Curse like soldiers, swear to God they'll see you burn in hell. You could fall in love with boys like this, so earnest, so eager, so ready to do whatever you ask, so full of themselves and the world. How do you tell them it's not that simple? How do you tell them question it all, question everything, even a coach, even a president? How do you tell them, ask the young dead soldiers coming home each night in aluminum boxes none of us is allowed to see? An army of shades. You tell the boys good work and call it a day. Stand alone in fading light while memory's phantoms circle the track like weary athletes running a race without a finish line. One more. This is my idea of a sort of happier poem. A little bit. Praying at the altar. I like pagodas. There's something, I don't know, secretive about them. Soul-soothing, mind-easing. Inside, if only for a moment, life's clutter disappears. Once, long ago, we destroyed one. Collapsed the walls till the roof caved in. Just a small one, all by itself in the middle of nowhere, when we were young and bored, armed to the teeth, and too much time on our hands. Now whenever I see a pagoda, I always go in. I'm not a religious man, but I light 3 joss sticks, bow 3 times to the Buddha, pray for my wife and daughter. I place the burning sticks in the vase before the altar. In Vung Tao, I was praying at the temple of the sleeping Buddha when an old monk appeared. He struck a large bronze bell with a wooden mallet. He was waking up the spirits to receive my prayers. Thank you.
I'm here because my parents worked for the War Resisters League during Vietnam, and they were conscientious objector counselors, and that is how they met. And I've been doing some research these past couple of years because I'm writing a memoir, much of which centers around the Vietnam War and their activism. And and so I'm going to read you some from my memoir, and then I'm going to read you a couple of poems from my book. And I came in from Canada, and this is really, it was a long trip, but I'm really, really humbled and honored to be here. And I've been really nervous just being in the company of heroes and people that I've read about in history books. And, you know, I grew up during this war, and I grew up in the shadow of the war and with parents who became lifelong activists. So this means a lot to me. So this is from my memoir. They sat hunched in tiger cages, their heads grazing the bars, signs hanging around their necks. I leapt from my father's arms and ran over to them, and the march continued past us with its drums and protest songs. I pushed my hands through the bars and reached out to them. A TV reporter asked me why I was crying, and the cameraman knelt down on one knee. I saw my own tiny reflection, my mouth twisted in anger. In the camera's eye, I was 3 years old. "Let them out," I screamed. The camera swung away as a hand reached between the bars to hold mine, and I saw my father smoking a cigarette on the side of the road. He wasn't trying to help the people in the cages either. "We're playing a game for the camera," whispered one of the caged people. "We can get out any time, but we want the world to see us in this cage on TV. It's only a game." To this day, I remember the Vietnam War as those people in cages. We'd go to the zoo and I'd think people put each other in cages too. It's only a game. Even a child knows no one would put themselves in a cage like that for fun. What kind of game is that? With cameras filming and a crowd staring, and you can't even stand up or go to the bathroom. I found some comfort in the thought that they'd cage themselves, but I didn't understand why. My parents were hippies who met at the War Resisters League at 339 Lafayette Street in New York City, where they worked as conscientious objector counselors during the Vietnam War. My mom was a Jew from Long Island who barely reached 4'10". My father, a Baptist turned Catholic from South Carolina, towered over her at 6'5".
Wow.
3 weeks after they met, they were married in People's Park in my father's hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, by a minister in the Universal Life Church. $25 to get certified. With flowers in their hair, my mother in a white handmade dress and barefoot, my father in jeans and his embroidered Mexican shirt, rope belly, also barefoot. They were both 19 years old. My father brought her home, and even though they were married, his mother made them sleep in separate bedrooms. Nana could not get over my mother's handmade clothes and how she did not know how to wash dishes, squirting soap on every single plate and glass instead of filling up the sink. "Who raised you, child?" she teased. My parents moved into a one-bedroom apartment on East 10th Street in Manhattan, between Avenue 1 and A. with a toilet in the closet, a shower stall in the living room, and a bathtub in the kitchen. My father would bathe with his feet in the sink and his head on the drain board. They lived on $50 a week, a meager living even then, subsisting on rice and beans and lo mein at Wohop in Chinatown. Still, at one point, 3 AWOL GIs crashed with them, with 2 in the living room and 1 in the kitchen, whose job it was to disassemble the kitchen table, a piece of slate supported by bricks and surrounded by pillows, each night, and put it back together before breakfast. At the War Resisters League, Papa ran the GI Counseling Project, where he counseled soldiers wanting to get out of active service and draftees trying not to go. Mom took over the hardship discharge cases and paperwork for the project, which she described as a bizarre form of social work with record keeping but no names or identifying information. She also proved to be an excellent forger. When she was pregnant with me, Papa wrote a letter to the editor of Playboy magazine about the GI Counseling Project and received 3,000 replies. From Vietnam, from small towns, from army bases, from the brig. Most respondents were no older than he was, many stationed in Vietnam and scared out of their wits, convinced they would never make it home. Some had left their mothers and siblings, and as the eldest child, watched their families struggle to feed themselves and keep their homes. Others wrote from the brig, already in prison for refusing to fight. And some were AWOL and on the run, desperate to avoid prison and with nowhere to go. Their friends and families turning them out. A few had gone on drug-fueled weekends and had epiphanies, claiming to have found a higher consciousness. They now faced military prison for desertion and drug use. On and on the letters pleaded, the desperation of soldiers and inductees scrawled out in pen or typed, misspelled, formal, and full of questions. They asked, "Who are you? What can you do for me? How do I get myself out of this?" My father had a set of typed responses. "You have rights. Here is a pamphlet. These are your options. You must document every step. Do not speak to the parole board. You need a lawyer. Here is a contact." He had become an expert on GI rights, on military law pertaining to conscientious objector status, this son of a general who dutifully reported when his draft notice arrived in the mail, but flunked the Army's physical exam due to asthma. When he wasn't counseling GIs, he was attending demonstrations. He had a ritual of playing Carry It On by Joan Baez before he left the house to commit civil disobedience. By the time I was a toddler, my father had been arrested 18 times. I knew we were at war, but I didn't know what war was. I knew the war was the reason people came in and out of the house at all hours of the night. It was the reason men slept on our living room floor for days and weeks at a time. It was the reason for parties, for potlucks and slideshows, concerts, for marches with signs and megaphones and singing. The war was the reason my father worked at home and my mother worked outside of it. It was the reason for almost everything. It was the reason we moved to Georgia and the reason we moved back to New York. It was the reason my parents loved each other and then the reason they didn't. My mother and father and my sister and I shared a house with a family of Mennonites in Atlanta, Georgia, and our home was the office for the southern chapter of the War Resisters League. Mom left the house each day for an office at Head Start, and Papa stayed home, watching me and my infant sister, typing on his typewriter, making phone calls. He baked soufflés. He made bread. He whirred smoothies with peanut butter and gave me peanut butter to eat out of the jar with a spoon. Playmates were never a problem because the rotating cast of young parents with kids coming through, and while the adults talked and smoked cigarettes and had meetings, we put aluminum pots on our heads and wore capes, and much of the time shunned clothes. In the evening, Mom stirred pasta into boiling water. She had a limited cooking repertoire, and laid cool cloths on her neck. Her long black hair was pinned up in the back. She said she never experienced such heat, and when Papa would bring a cold beer to the table, she'd reach for it and put it to her forehead. By the time I was 3, she struggled to pick me up, her 90 pounds helpless against my bulk. I spent a lot of time hugging her knees and lifting her skirts to my face. She nursed my sister and tucked her feet underneath her as she sat down to a late glass of wine. And when my sister fell asleep, she put her in the crib and returned to her chair to stitch embroidered ribbons of red and purple flowers onto my denim overalls, or sew me a dress. Papa had a restless energy. He stood and sat and stood. When he talked, he liked to make his point in story form. You'll understand this when I tell you the story of a young man who showed up one day at my desk and wouldn't leave until I bought him a hot dog, even though I had $1 in my pocket and mouths to feed at home, and he wanted my help in the first place with his papers. But before we could even get to talking about it, he said, "Look here, I need a hot dog, a real street cart hot dog, to quiet the conversation in my gut so that I can listen to you." And I had to tell the line of boys in the hall to cool it for a while and take a seat so I could buy this one a hot dog, because that's half the work, you know, half the work. Papa liked Pabst Blue Ribbon and Lucky Strikes. His legs didn't fit under the table, so anyone moving around the kitchen had to step over them 100 times, and his long hairy toes that stuck out of his sandals. We saw men come and go, living with us for a stint before a new rotation. My bedroom was given to Allen Ginsberg for 6 weeks, and I was treated to my own campsite in the living room, a flashlight, a makeshift fort. He and my father went bar hopping every night after supper, and my mom said years later that that should have been a clue. We moved to Atlanta. This is later in the book. We moved to Atlanta, Georgia when I was nearly 2. My parents charged with launching a southern chapter of the War Resisters League. My father said New York had everything, all the GI organizing and services, all the national headquarters, and he wanted to go where he was needed, work from the ground up. Our Atlanta home became a way station for lefty politicos passing through the South. When Jane Fonda was traveling on her FTA tour, Fuck the Army, you guys all know, a traveling vaudeville against the war, she and Tom Hayden stayed with us too, and her daughter and I moved back to my living room fort. Tom washed the dishes while Jane chain smoked and told stories, and my parents didn't have much to offer in a way of comfort or food. It was the anti-war tour. Mom came home to strangers in her kitchen cooking for her kids, and the standard pile of unwashed dishes, and a husband who had important anti-war meetings to attend, and military deserters sneaking in to crash for a few days before they stole away in the night, ferried along by an underground network. It was a maelstrom of snotty noses and diapers, a disappearing husband, and wiretapped phone that clicked during her calls to her mother, and the FBI again at the front door while someone jumped out a window and ran, and rushing my sister to the hospital with a seizure that no one could explain, least of all my dad, who may or may not have been watching her, and me with a spinal tap for suspected meningitis and no health insurance. That's it for that chapter. So, it's a work in progress. So I'm just going to read you 2 poems from my book, Radio Weather. So I had mentioned the letters. So my father had written to Playboy magazine, which was actually a brilliant idea, and gotten 3,000 replies. And I have a lot of the letters. And so when I was working on my first book, I was sitting on these things for decades, just like torturing myself over what to do with them. I felt really guilty for just having them in a box. So I pieced them together and I made a long poem out of them. So the note here says, this poem is an assemblage from letters sent to my father, who from 1969 to 1972, it's really 73, worked as a conscientious objector counselor in New York City for the GI Counseling Project through the War Resisters League. Letters from Vietnam. Dear Sirs, I am in the Air Force, stationed in Little Rock, Arkansas, waiting to go to Vietnam. Like most sane people, I have no desire to go. I realize I should have started my attempt to get out a long time ago. They don't really give you much time to think. I hate war and everything to do with war. Why should myself and others have to go every place in the world and fight and never know the reason why, except that we were ordered by someone that doesn't even know or care whether or not we exist? I would rather get out legally than become a deserter. I need your help. Dear Sirs, I attended an Army military academy prior to entering the Air Force. God just didn't create me to be part of the military. The whole scene is just too far gone. I have a clean military record, however. I have my chick and a fine family to think about. I would like to get out with a respectable discharge and sail to the island of Kauai and do some country living. I have considered going AWOL. I feel like a little kid, having to sneak around with my long hair and being my real self. I'm fed up with their way of thinking. I find the thought of the military war machine distasteful and against the basic instincts of man. Dear Sirs, I have been in the Army for 2.5 years and been to that God-forsaken place called Vietnam. Thank God I didn't kill anyone. My mother died. I went AWOL for about 4 days. I was told I had to return, but I flatly refused. My family has called me a communist. I believe I'm classified as a deserter now. I intend on turning myself in when I get a lawyer. I have nowhere to go. Do you have any suggestions where I could go or live? Here's my Vietnam patch, my VFW card, and my 3 Purple Hearts. I am getting sick of looking at them. Dear Sirs, I enlisted about 3 months ago after having become frustrated with college. I couldn't justify spending my father's money any longer to avoid the draft. I concluded the Navy was my best hope. It would keep me out of Vietnam, pay for my education, and give me experience in photography. I can now see that my reasoning was completely faulty, but at the time I was confused and desperate. I am sure I cannot endure 4 years. I have considered refusing any orders, to run. I'm afraid my convictions are not strong enough to counteract the disastrous effects of an undesirable discharge on the rest of my life. Dear Sirs, I am currently serving with the Air Force, attempting to gain conscientious objector status. I cannot serve a government which wages senseless wars, oppresses minority groups, does practically nothing about pollution, etc. I'm writing to request some help and some reassurance. There are people who care not only about our nation, but the world community. That way I would not feel as though I am beating my head against a wall of military minds that think more of death counts and SS9s than integrity. Dear Sirs, I am stationed in Vietnam and face another tour. I am at the end of my rope. I have just gotten to the place where I just don't give a damn. I'm trying to find some reasonable means of getting out. The fact remains, I was made to do something I didn't believe in. I have almost been killed once, so maybe you will understand I have no desire to flirt with death again. I am only interested in getting out of the service in order to lead a more real and meaningful life. Dear Sirs, I believe I was illegally drafted. My first pre-induction physical found I was not medically qualified for military duty. I was given an L3 profile. Reasons: polio at age 5. It afflicted me with muscle atrophy of ankle, leg, calf, and muscle thigh. My right leg is shorter than left. bilateral hallux valgus and residual deformity. My second pre-induction physical found me medically qualified. I want to get a discharge. I guess I am like most GIs. I don't know of any rights I have, because the people that run the show only tell you about the ones that can be used against you. And, dear sirs, I am presently detained at Fort Riley on court-martial after being AWOL. I was gone 7 months. It's lonely and sometimes very depressing. You can't send literature as far as I know, but a book? It cannot be about sex, pornography, communism, the new movements of today, left or right, any type of subversive material. Tell yourself that you should raise your child with peace in mind and to help the world be a better place for mankind. God bless you, your wife, and your almost child. Yours truly. And that last one was sent the month before my birth. Do I have time to read one more?
Mediumly?
Yeah, mediumly.
Sure.
Okay, this is just the last one, Living with the Dead. This one's not about Vietnam. My dead don't like winter. It's too much like eternity. They want it always to be spring, the windows open and the lights left on. They remember the pinch of wind on their faces, twisting their ankles on rocks. The world, they say, is full of danger. Better to live with books and music and the phone unplugged. They've driven away more people than I can remember. What's more, they lie. They rewrite history, always coming out good in the story. They want to really discuss their lives and what they amounted to, the mark they left, which means on me. They want my version succinct and with a healthy dose of redemption, so they know whatever mistakes they've made have been mended. The dead don't like loose ends. They're healthy and tan and thinner, the sickness gone, gray hair returned to brown, burns and scars faded, the yellowed skin pinkish again. Their bodies don't show punctured veins, and they don't need sleep. I should know they never change, but where else does wisdom come from? Without the fallible world, I figured they'd learn a thing or two, maybe pass it on to make things easier on those who'd suffered when they'd gone. They don't care for easing my mind. They want to know if I've thought of them lately, and what I remember, and how I can possibly love another in their absence, after all we've been through. They want my life and dreams and future dreams to include them all. I want this too. I make room for them, a corner or a shelf for each, and I talk to them when I'm alone. Why should I neglect them just because they're dead? My house is jammed full of those who don't want the door open, who want the world brought in with little intrusion from strangers, where for whom time means nothing, and living in the mind is more real than the outside world. I'm happy to oblige. It's the least I can do. Thank you.
I envy a lot of you Vietnam guys, a lot of you Vietnam vets, not for your war, because that shit was fucked up, from what I heard, but for two reasons. First, because your war ended, and second, because so many of you got to go back. You know, it strikes me that an anti-war movement, or even an strong anti-war feeling, can't just be about no, right? It can't just be a negation. There has to be something affirmative there. There has to be a yes to, you know, cross-cultural engagement, to connection, understanding, complexity, some kind of reconciliation. And none of that comes easy. But I think very, very few Iraq vets are ever gonna get any of that. Very, very few of them are ever gonna get to go back to Iraq or engage with the culture there. Partly it's because of ongoing conflict, but partly there's also, it seems, kind of like a dead spot, right, in our culture, a blind spot. When we look at the Middle East, we see terrorists or victims or ISIS or fundamentalists or this or that, but so rarely, almost never, do we see people. But I was lucky enough to get to go back to Baghdad, where I was a soldier in 2003 to 2004. I went back 4 years ago in 2014 for Rolling Stone to sort of do a story about the legacy of the occupation there, and also to observe the elections that are going on. And I met there at a poll center on election day an Iraqi soldier who inspired the story that I'm going to read from tonight. He was this young guy in his army t-shirt and his army pants, and I think he had flip-flops on, and he had a bandage around his head. He'd just come in from the field. He'd been wounded fighting ISIS. And my translator was like, "You got to talk to him." And so I did, and he was just so hopeful about the possibilities for the election, and so committed to the idea of his country, of Iraq, like developing into something. It was difficult to know what to do with. And especially because I realized, when I interviewed him, when I talked to him, right, thinking back to when I'd been there as a soldier, he would have been 8 years old, right, 9 years old. He would have been a kid. And now he's the next generation of fighters. So, I wrote about him he made it into the story in Rolling Stone, but he just stuck with me, and so. I got the opportunity I was invited to participate in this forthcoming anthology. Akashic Books does this series of noir anthologies. They're all geographically focused, right? Istanbul noir, London noir, New Orleans noir. Well, they're coming out with a Baghdad noir this summer. It's a lot of Iraqi writers, a lot of Iraqi expatriates, and I was lucky enough to be very honored to be invited to participate. And so this story, I went back to that guy I saw, and wrote about him a little bit, or some fictional version of him. I should have noted when I started. Okay, so it's a long story. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you should just buy the anthology this summer. But I'll get through what I can. It's called Homecoming. A tumult of hands, pain, and a mouth filled with sand. Then he was being carried back behind a Humvee. The medic checked his ABCs, dragged a nearby rucksack to one side of his head, and dug a helmet in under the other. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, but his pupils were fine, and the ugly cut on his scalp seemed shallow. The skull appeared to be intact. The medic bandaged his head, stuck him with an IV, and told another wounded soldier, a corporal sitting up against the Humvee, to keep him awake. Then the medic moved off to another casualty. "You lucked out, Hyder," the corporal said as he lit a cigarette. "That IED killed your buddies, but that's a victory wound you got there. You go home, everybody thinks you're Ali Hussein. Some real Rambo shit." Hyder just grunted. The man patted his arm. I know. Things seem pretty shitty right now. But take heart. The good news is, your little scrape doesn't even hurt yet." 3 days, 2 army trucks, and 1 taxi ride later, Hyder was cursing Corporal Hamza's good news. He paid the driver, his hands clumsy and his whole body stiff, and grabbed his gym bag out of the back seat. Squinting at the clogged traffic, he listened to the car horns vibrating through the roundabout on Al Jumeirah Street. He wove around old Datsuns, new Chinese pickups, and the occasional BMW. He cut his way across and into the swift human currents of Rashid Street, his head pounding in the bright June light. He dodged a cart piled high with boxes, feet slipping on orange peels tossed in the street by the juice man, and ducked around a tray of river carp, sliding into the shade between the old buildings and the vendors' umbrellas. Market life flashed around him, glowing with the strangeness of a dream. Sacks of spice like pigments on a pallet, dusky red pepper powders, luminous ochre, turmeric, and the muddy green of za'atar. Plastic Chinese housewares and rows of lurid pink and neon green, a rainbow mosaic of tea boxes, multicolored powdered drink mixes, and purple-brown jars of date syrup. Frilly dresses in electric blue, hazard yellow, and bloody violet, covered in dancing mermaids and Disney princesses. Innumerable squat bottles like great chunks of jade, amber, and garnet. Hand soaps, dish soaps, shampoos. It was always a change coming in from the field, but this was something else. The smells made him queasy, the colors knifed into his eyes, and the swirl of bodies gave him a feeling of vertigo, part euphoria and part fear. His head throbbed. He was relieved to turn off Rashid Street and to Al Safafir Market, practically empty these days, and leave the tumult behind him. It was quiet here. The street of the coppersmiths led off toward the river, the long, cool arcade gleaming within from the copper lamps, plates, pots, vases, and candelabras spilling into the otherwise vacant, brick-lined walk. The shining display always seemed enchanting at first when you stepped into the souk, but nowadays it was mostly imported crap from India and China. Baghdad's legendary smiths had become just that, legendary. Nobody wanted to pay for handmade work, so the old men sold what people would buy, while their sons left the souk's backroom smithies in search of better prospects, like joining the army. "Hader!" a voice shouted from one of the stalls. "Peace be upon you." "Upon you be peace," Uncle Hader responded, recognizing long-faced Saeed, one of his father's old friends. "Are you home from the fight?" Saeed asked, stepping out into the arcade. It took Hader a second to understand the question, which echoed oddly in his ears. When he caught the gist, he smiled. "Daesh gave me a birthday present," he said, tapping his head. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for ISIS. "Now I have a week of leave." A complex look of concern flashed across Saeed's face. "I'm glad you're safe. Have you seen your father yet?" "I'm on my way there now." "Listen, Hader," Saeed said, glancing around the souk. "It's none of my business, but Abu Bakr ran into some trouble. He's not well up here, you know." Saeed patted his forehead. "What happened?" "You should hear it from him, but there's no need to get involved, okay? Sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." "What do you mean?" Saeed put his hand on Haider's shoulder. "Just trust me, nephew, okay? Remember how your father gets sometimes. You don't need to fix things. What's done is done." Haider looked at the old man with a measure of understanding. "God's will," he said. Abu Bakr anxiously greeted his last living son from a wheelchair, as if hiding something. Haider's mother stood behind the old coppersmith, her mouth rigid and compressed, but her eyes full of emotion. They were surprised to see him home and wanted to hear about his wound, but Haider waved it off and asked them what had happened. "I'm not feeling so well," Abu told him, laughing. "What's wrong?" Haider asked. "It's just arthritis," Abu muttered. "A cursed man," Haider's mother added. "Nadi, please," Abu said, grinning again. "It's nothing." "Father, will you let me see your legs?" Haider asked. "There's no reason for that. They're fine," Abu assured him. "That's because they're gone," Nadia snapped. "Gone, the old fool." She slammed her tea glass down on the table and stormed out of the kitchen. Haider could see it now, under the blanket, how Abu's legs ended at the knees. He thought that there was something wrong with the way they looked, but he hadn't understood what. It took Haider all afternoon to get the story out. This was the tale that his father told him. I'm going to skip ahead. What Abu Bakr tells his son is that business had been worse than usual, so he went to a local sort of strongman named Abu Lulua, and asked for work, and Abu Lulua sent him to go make a delivery to Rutba, which is on the Syrian border. He goes and he drives out there in his truck, and the guy he's supposed to meet doesn't show, so he takes a nap, and then he wakes up and these guys are robbing his truck. So he drives back to Baghdad. Abu Bakr does. He drives back to Baghdad with this empty truck, and he tells Abu Lulua, look, like I got robbed. So Abu Lulua calls him a liar and takes his truck and cuts his legs off as punishment. So Abu Bakr tells Haider that Haider leaned back, took a drag on his cigarette, and peered at his crippled father. It had gotten dark and their tea had gotten cold, but neither of them moved to turn on a light. He could hear his mother watching TV in the other room. I didn't want to tell you, his father said. I wasn't going to tell you. What would that solve? Haider asked. I can still work, his father claimed, holding up his hands. Your mother can find a job, we'll survive. And you have your career in the army. I didn't want to give you anything to worry about. Haider's head throbbed all along the wound, which was slowly healing across his scalp and into his eyeballs. Patience was a struggle, as was controlling the anger he felt seeping out into his limbs, an icy, oily burn, languid and murderous. What about the tribe? Would you tell them? Haider asked. I told them what I told the police. And where's the truck? His father shook his head. Lulua kept it. Your mother went back to get it after, but they said it was payment for what I'd stolen. Promise me you won't do anything, my son. Promise me for your mother's sake. Abu Lulua was dangerous, it was true, and his right-hand man, the hawk, was no joke. Father should have never gone to them, Haider thought. And fucking up the delivery? Why do you have to take a nap? He could imagine explaining the whole thing away as an old man's stupidity. You play Dambala with a gangster like Abu Lulua, what do you expect? He was lucky to be alive. Still, the injustice of it rankled. And what was more galling, even more than the dishonor to his tribe, was that he was a soldier. Sure, he wasn't some Golden Division commando, but he was a veteran in a real fighting company, not one of those paper units that broke and ran like dogs. When Abu Lulua touched his father, he touched him. It didn't matter who was right or wrong, who was a fool or who was a big shot. What mattered was that you let that motherfucker hurt you or you make him stop. That's all this was. Not honor, not justice, not prudence, but a fight. And Haider knew how to fight. He stood and put his hand on his father's shoulder. You should rest, father. The first thing Haider did in the morning was buy a pistol. It took a couple of hours, but in the end he found a nice American M9, cheap. Then he went to see Abu Lulua. At that hour of the morning, before the heat rose, the Shorja market was a riot of bodies, bargain hunters and deliverymen, vendors and beggars, and those like Haider who came on other kinds of business. He wove through the crowded lanes, reliving the assault on his senses from yesterday, pushing past piles of clothes, toys, knives, copperware, and household electronics, all made in China, India, and Vietnam. It was just like the markets in Souk al-Safafir. Before the collapse, they'd had nothing but what they could make or scavenge, plus the trickle of imports, mostly medical supplies allowed through the sanctions and the oil for food program. The embargo cats ran a thriving black market in goods smuggled over from Syria, Turkey, and Iran, but the supplies were unpredictable and outrageously expensive. Somehow they got through it, though, surviving the malnutrition, diarrhea, and starvation on the strength of Iraq's farms and date orchards. Now they imported their dates from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The orchards still produced, but the foreign corporations that had rushed in and bought up the country during the collapse exported the Iraqi dates. The Americans had opened the country to globalization. After standing idly by while looters stripped the country for parts, the Coalition Provisional Authority invited the Egyptians, Chinese, Russians, Kuwaitis, Saudis, and South Koreans to come feast on what was left at bargain basement prices. And so, through 8 years of occupation and 11 years of war, through the collapse, the Americans, and Al-Qaeda, Iran, and now Daesh, the country was flooded with cheap imports. These imports included staples like dates and eggs, rice and cheese, DVDs and cars, PVC pipes and cell phones, satellite dishes and knockoff designer shoes, flash frozen chicken fingers, soccer jerseys, and copper pots. It was a miracle. The only problem was nobody had the money to buy anything. Unless you worked for the government, the army, or an oil company, you were probably just struggling to feed your family. While every day new malls sprang up alongside new shops and new Saddams like Abu Lulua. Haider could see Lulua down the lane, sitting in his stall, broad-chested and smiling, talking carefully to somebody's grandma. The hawk was there too, reading a newspaper, and the usual gangbangers, and the kid. For all the world, it looked like a normal stand, largish maybe for a place that sold sweets and nuts, but nothing out of the ordinary. As Haider watched the big man, a bead of sweat slid along his spine, kissing the handle of the pistol where it was jammed in the back of his pants. His head still hurt, but he'd ignore that for now. He saw Abu Lulua notice him. Then the hawk, turning the pages of his paper, looked over to follow his boss's eye. Now they were both watching him, and their gazes were a force transforming the market lane into a cataract of energy. Haider could sense it in his wounded scalp, in his fingers, and all the way down the line of tables. It was the way you felt before an attack, locking into a pattern of violence that had its own force, its own will, its own rhythms. Inshallah, he thought, walking into his fate. I'm going to stop there. So.
Lovely listeners, do you have some questions for any of our?
Where are your lessons? Where are the lessons?
In my house.
They should be in an archive.
I know, I need to.
And they should be in an archive and talk to this man's father.
I know, I need to finish writing my book.
Okay, but they should go. They should go somewhere where they can be.
I've already talked to the Swarthmore Peace Archive.
Okay, that's cool. Excellent choice.
Bill, what got you around to writing poetry?
How do I make this short? Well, it won't be short. This is why I don't like talking to reporters. I started writing poetry when I was 15. I wasn't going to be the quarterback of the football team or anything like that, and I got to an age where I wanted girls to notice me, and I found that if I wrote a poem and stuck it in Linda Titus's locker at school, and then when I saw her at lunch and asked her to go to the movies with me, I had a much better chance of getting a yes. I wanted to be, I wanted to be noticed. People, I was writing for 2 years before I ever joined the Marines. The Marine Corps did not make me a writer. The Vietnam War did not make me a writer. You heard me reading Vietnam War poems tonight, but the body of my work is enormous and it ranges all over the place. I know a lot of guys who went to Vietnam and didn't become poets, and I know a lot of poets who never went to Vietnam. There's no real, certainly the Vietnam War gave me a hell of a lot to write about, but even when I was writing about the war at its most intense, and that was in the first few years after I came home and started college, I was writing about geese in the autumn and broken-hearted love poems. Man, I got a raft of those suckers. I didn't meet my wife until I was like 31 years old, so I got tons of broken-hearted love poems. So that, I don't know, I can't play the guitar. I'd love to fill a Wells Fargo Center with 18,000 screaming fans, but I can't play the guitar. I can't sing. When my daughter was 3 years old, she asked me to stop singing her to sleep. So, no, it's just what I do.
Actually, it's not quite, I just want to thank Roy. Yeah. I just want to thank you for writing a story about an Iraq and with that perspective, because so much the obsession in this country with American lives and American soldiers, and it's very refreshing. I know it's a challenge, and I think I just really like the fact that you